Hi, everybody. I'm, to this day, John Atack so far. And this is John Hunter, PhD, who has, I think, some remarkable insights, which I'm very glad that you're going to be sharing with us, John. So let's carry on from where we left off last time, eh?
Perfect. Yeah, very good to see you again. And yeah, looking forward to it.
So launch us into the subject, if you would.
Okay, great. I mean, I think last time we spent quite a lot of time talking about the biological manipulation or the neurobiological manipulation that it seems may be occurring in large group awareness training. So essentially the dopaminergic defense, putting people through a significant amount of stress for a period of time and then abruptly replacing it with social reward or love and joy and affirmation and those sorts of things, and how that can trigger an elevated state.
So in simple, what happens is that when you're put
Yeah.
under stress, you'll produce more dopamine to cope with it. And if you're then dropped into a reward, then you'll get a flood of dopamine. Do I have that?
In very simple terms. I mean, I think the other thing to maybe mention, which is spoken about in Anna Lemke's book, Dopamine Nation, is the idea of the pleasure-pain balance. So if you put a person through a significant amount of pain or psychological pain, stress for a period of time, then the dopamine system becomes more sensitive to reward. So by creating that stressful period and then applying a very sort of powerful social reward, you have this exaggerated response. And essentially LGATs, or large group awareness trainings, are putting people through an environment that is not normal. And because of that, you're getting an abnormal response. I think it was Viktor Frankl who said an abnormal response to an abnormal situation is normal. And I think that's what's going on in large group awareness trainings. But that's the effect that these organizations or these trainings seem to have on mood or affect. So people feel euphoric and confident and optimistic and hugely energetic and productive and creative and all these sorts of things. And it's seen by them as confirmation almost of what they're being told. So a lot of the philosophies and some of the obligations that are mentioned throughout the seminar are made to seem more true or more real than what I think a rational person would conclude if they were given the time and space to consider it. So what I wanted to talk about is something called the Elaboration Likelihood Model. And so moving from sort of the neurobiology to the psychology of persuasion, there's this model that was developed, I think, in 1980 by Richard Petty and John Cacioppo. And it's known as the Elaboration Likelihood Model. And again, in the last time we spoke, we said the dopaminergic defense hypothesis is not as it's not as intimidating as it sounds. And similarly, the Elaboration Likelihood Model, all that it really is, if you substitute the word thinking for elaboration, then you've got a very good sense of what it's about. So basically, it's a model to predict how likely it is that a person's going to think deeply about something before making a decision about it. And this is a model that's well accepted within mainstream psychology. So, I mean, I think the initial article's been cited, I don't know, 8,000 or 10,000 times. So it's not a fringe model. It's very well accepted. And very basically, what the model says is that there are two routes to persuasion. There's the central route and there's the peripheral route. And the central route relies on taking your time and looking at all of the evidence. And that's effectively engaging your rational brain.
So this is like Kahneman's system 1, system 2.
So the central route would be aligned with Kahneman's system 2 perfectly, 100%. Yeah. So if you've read Thinking Fast and Slow, then the central route aligns with system 2, and then the peripheral route aligns with system 1, which is quick thinking. So it's much easier, it's faster, it relies on heuristics, but it can be wrong. So it's useful to use it a lot of the time. We don't have the mental capacity to think through everything that we need to think through, but so we use the the peripheral route or system one. However, it can be manipulated because it's not relying on evidence, it's relying on a certain number of shortcuts. And what I would argue is that in large group awareness training, certainly, and I'm sure your viewers will be able to comment on the degree to which it happens in other groups. What takes place in a large group awareness training is that they make it far more likely that you're going to use the peripheral routes, and then they manipulate features of the peripheral routes, which or they know how to manipulate things that affect your peripheral routes thinking. So what's the authors, Petty and Cacioppo, argues that there are two main things that affect how likely it is that you're going to think about things deeply. So how likely it is that you'll use the central routes, and that is whether you have the ability and whether you have the motivation to think about these things. So in terms of ability, it refers to whether you have the intelligence, and then some psychologists have thrown in opportunity as well. So you might have the intelligence, but you just may not have the time or to actually get through all the evidence. So that's got to do with ability. The other thing is motivation. So do you think it's worth your time to actually figure this thing out? So for example, if you go to a dentist, you'll probably trust that the dentist is going to give you reasonable advice. If you go to a doctor, you don't have time to go and study medicine just so you can make those decisions for yourself. So sometimes you have to outsource your thinking, which is a heuristic, obviously. And you might think, well, maybe I've got the ability to figure all this stuff out, but I don't necessarily have the time, and I'm not really motivated to do it. I'm going to find some way of deciding whether I should trust this doctor or not, and then I'm going to outsource my thinking to that person. So what you see in a large group awareness training is that over the 3 or 4 or 5 days that the training occurs, is that both of these elements, ability and motivation, are very severely undermined. So ability is going to be undermined because you're sitting in sessions for 12 hours at a minimum. So you're there from 9 in the morning till maybe 10 at night, 11 at night, 12 at night. They're relatively short breaks. You're getting very tired. There's an overload of information. So if you hear any people talking about going through these things, there's a huge amount of information. It's often presented in quite an obscure way. So it's supposed to be, I would say that it's philosophically pompous. Like there's a lot of jargon thrown around, and it's quite difficult to really understand it. So you get very tired. There's a ton of information. Additionally, you don't have the opportunity to really think about it and knock ideas back and forth with people because you can't sit next to the same person after a break. The breaks are relatively short. You're supposed to use the breaks to call people up. They give you homework every night. So even when you leave at 10, maybe 12 o'clock, then you've got to go and complete this homework. There's no time to really reflect on anything. So your ability to think about the information that's being presented is highly limited. In terms of motivation, they spend quite a lot of time convincing you very basically to not think about it. I mean, I don't really know how else to say that, but they'll say to participants, come from your heart, not from your head, that kind of thing. There's no way that you're going to be able to understand all of these things. You need to just trust the process. So there's a lot of emphasis on really just trusting the process, and also huge amounts of emphasis on personal experience. So not only are they undermining critical thinking, but they're also elevating experience as a supreme way of knowing. So then at the end, when they trigger this really powerful experience, participants are not able to think about things. They haven't had time to process, and they are more likely to take that experience and use it as a substitute for real critical thinking and running through the evidence. So that's the sort of framework, or what I'd like to kind of start by speaking about. I'd like to run through a couple of other things that sort of align with peripheral route thinking. So things that participants are unaware of that may be influencing them, but that are very likely influencing them. Okay, so I've got a couple of things written down, so I might have to just check my notes every now and again. All right, so when people are in a state of not thinking for themselves, one of the things that they're likely to do is to outsource their thinking to an authority figure. That authority figure can be an individual. It can be a group of individuals. So it can be the group of people that you're with. So if you're not really sure about what's going on, it's quite likely that you'll look around you to try and get a sense of what the right way to behave is, the right way to respond is, all that sort of things. And an authority figure can actually also just be an organization. So say, for example, or an individual at an organization. So if there's an individual who works for Harvard or Stanford or Oxford or Cambridge, or if Cambridge has, for example, endorsed a particular product or program or something like that, that's going to be a shortcut. Rather than looking into the information for yourself, you might say, okay, well, they obviously know what they're doing, so I'm going to trust them.
When I was a kid, cigarettes would have by appointment to whichever royal house smoked them. So that told us that we should be smoking Dunhill because the Queen smoked them or what have you. So that appeal to an authority, because obviously royal people know a lot about tobacco and the qualities of tobacco.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, soccer players know a lot about which chips you should eat, and
John Travolta and Tom Cruise know that you ought to be a Scientologist. So
yeah, and so our brains do work in a strange way in terms of authority. I mean, and we make these kind of associations between various things in authority in quite an odd way. I mean, there was an interesting study done at a university, and I can't remember exactly where it was, but what happened was that a person would come into a room full of students, and the person would be introduced either just by their name or by their qualification, and then or by their qualification, and the qualification would get higher and higher. So that if they were introduced as this person with a master's degree, then whatever, then this person with a PhD, and then this person who has published X number of articles and done whatever. And all that they did was they asked the students in the different groups to estimate how tall the person was. And the higher the qualification, the taller the person was estimated to be. And they've done the same thing with presidential candidates. So before the election, before it's decided, they ask, couple thousand people to estimate how tall each of the candidates are. And then after the election, and inevitably after the election, the person who's won gets estimated to be taller, the person who's lost gets estimated to be shorter than what they were originally estimated to be. So we've got this very strange association with authority. But what occurs in LGATs is that, and Margaret Singer spoke about this in Cults in Our Midst, and if you read my PhD, you'll see a number of examples of this. But the trainers will come in, and a lot of what they do is about establishing themselves as authority figures. Yeah. The way that they dress, the way that they project themselves, the way that they talk, their confidence, everything there is about asserting authority. And it's not only about elevating their own authority, it's also about undermining the authority of the participants. So what happens is an authority gap starts to develop over the duration of the training. So people kind of come in maybe thinking that they're in line. The trainer starts elevating himself or herself and pushing everyone else down. And the wider that gap, the greater the chances that individuals are going to start doubting themselves and start outsourcing their thinking to the trainers.
I mean, to interrupt at that point, when I arrived in Scientology, I was told that the man who'd started it was a wounded war hero who had developed a psychotherapy that had cured his war wounds. He had studied with gurus in the East, and he was a nuclear physicist. So he had brought together the mysticism of the East with precision science and was able to do this thing. None of these things was in fact true, but it creates, a huge authority for this guy that he's achieved these things. In fact, he was a pulp writer and a congenital liar, but there you go.
Exactly, and it's not only the individuals that are elevated like that. So the technology and the background is also distorted. So when you look at the history of LGATs, you see clearly cognitive therapy principles are being
Mm.
brought in. There's elements of Scientology, there's elements of this and that, and they
Rational
kind of
emotive.
acknowledge to a degree,
Mm.
but there's also the sense given that, and every LGAT seems to do this, that they have created something new and special.
Mm.
And the more time you spend looking at them, you realize that everyone's pretty much doing, very similar things, if not the same things.
Pretty much the same. I've observed elsewhere that in the last year, the people who started The Secret, the law of attraction, have come back and said, 14 years later, we have found a new secret. And they then explain what they've found. And by strange chance, the next thing that came up on my feed was a Napoleon Hill documentary from 1953, I think, where he said exactly the same things that they had just discovered, So
yeah. Well, I mean, Napoleon Hill is cited as one of Earhart's major inspirations as well. So, yeah. So we've got the technology that's being elevated as an authority. We've got the individual being elevated. We've got the participants are being pushed down, but also the participants have to agree to a very specific set of rules at the beginning, which means that they can't really interact. So if the trainer is able to control the room, then while individuals are kind of looking around trying to figure out what's going on, they're likely to take cues from other people in the room. And you get this kind of sense of kind of group ignorance, where everyone is relying on everyone else to try and figure out what's going on. What a lot of people don't realize is that stooges or plants are present in a lot of these seminars as well. So they know the right way to respond. They are giving the answers that are getting the positive responses from the trainers and that sort of thing. So these people can actually shift the way that everyone is interpreting things in quite a significant way. So that's the one thing. I think something else that participants are not aware of is the effect of commitment. So Robert Cialdini speaks about it in Influence, and Edgar Schein spoke about it in terms of how, during the Korean War, the Chinese were very aware of how public commitments were very likely to lead to specific types of behaviors. And so at the beginning of an LGAT, the trainers will often sit with participants and say to them, do you commit to staying, for the rest of the training? Do you commit to these rules? And there's another element to those commitments. So those are public commitments, but there's also an element of responsibility. So you're far more likely to accept responsibility for everything that you've been through and agreed to if you don't feel that you've been manipulated into doing anything. So at the start of the training, the trainers will sit with participants and they'll sit with them one by one and say, who has been forced to come here? And some hands will go up. And then they'll sit with each person and work with them until they acknowledge that it was actually their decision to come there. And when you read some of the encounters, it's quite hilarious, because a person will say, well, my wife said if I don't come, then we're going to get divorced, so I feel like I am under pressure. And through 10, 15, 30 an hour long conversation, eventually the person will say, okay, I acknowledge that it's my choice to be here. And that plays a role later on.
I mean, that's something that's also tested in Scientology, that when you get to the so-called study technology, you're being told, if you are not here on your own determinism and for yourself, then you will not benefit in any way. And then the other part of it is, if you leave, it's well, you weren't here on your own determinism, and so it didn't work for you. So they've got you either way. And
the goal is to elicit agreements from participants while they are there. So it's just, when the participant says, I will get family and friends to come, I will do X, Y, and Z. If you feel like you've been bullied into doing it, then afterwards you can just go, no, I was bullied, so I don't want to do it, and I feel fine about it. But if you feel like it was your decision, nobody's pressurizing you, then it's more likely that you'll follow through on that. A big area of focus within LGATs is the concept of integrity, which I find hilarious. But a lot of time is spent on integrity. And
I
really
was yesterday reading about Van Earhart having his followers choke his wife almost to death to humiliate her, talking about integrity, you know?
Yes, well, I mean, there is a book written to refute that. That I would
Well, the
recommend.
statement I read was by the physician who actually choked her. So
Uh,
he seemed to think he'd
Bob
been told to do
Lassel,
it, you know?
yeah, Bob Lassel, and
Yeah.
I mean, apparently that's not good enough evidence for some
Mm.
people. Apparently, it was a conspiracy by Scientology. So
Oh,
that's
yeah.
the
Yeah.
that's the
That would make sense of it.
the other side of the story.
And let me
Um,
just add for the amusement of our audience that I was approached by Van Earhart to help him defend himself against Scientology in 1991. And while I was still mulling over the ethical dilemma of this, he ran away to South America because allegations were being made by his wife and his children about his abuse of them. So
and as employees.
I touched that story at that point, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I'd advise anyone to have a look at the evidence if they can find it from both sides
Of
and weigh
course,
it up and
always.
see which seems more valid.
Yes, more credible.
Yeah. So then another thing that Cialdini speaks about is one-sided information. And I mean, and this is obviously something that we're very aware of. And, you know, studies again have been done on this where they'll give people one side of an argument in a law case, and then they'll give other people the other side of the argument. And then these people will be told, you've only been given one side. There is another side, but they will still think that the side that they've got is definitely must be the correct answer. So we obviously see this with the echo chambers online and with news sources that really present either information from the left or from the right, that if you're fed only one side of the information, it's very difficult to think critically about things. And in an LGAT environment, the trainer is very much controlling what information is shared. So if the participant is trying to say something that goes against the leader's ideas, they'll be shut down and humiliated, and they won't be able to really get that point across, or they'll be made to look quite stupid. And that's not necessarily because they're wrong. It's because the trainers are in a position where they're controlling the communication and the dialogue in a very specific way. So again, participants may not be aware that they're not hearing both sides of the story while they are sitting in.
And there is a group thing that happens there. I had a call many years ago from a therapist who'd attended a course in reevaluation co-counseling, and she very quickly during this course said, "But this sounds awfully like Ron Hubbard's Dianetics." And it
Yes.
wasn't just the person teaching it, but the whole class were going, no, we want to learn this thing, stop it. Now, it is Dianetics and nothing more, nothing less. Jackins lied and said that it wasn't. I found a picture of him shaking hands with Hubbard, receiving a certificate, which I think disproved that. And then again, there were allegations of abuse against Jackins, and the Open University, the largest university in the world, had been teaching its students these methods, I think, for 20 years by then. And I'd protested and said, this is what you're doing, and nothing happened. And then Jackins is tainted, and the method no longer works, we find, which is a little difficult for me.
Yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of these things do give these immediate sort of short-term senses of knowing or highs or whatever, and people don't like to give up their favorite toy when it seems to be working very nicely for them. So
it's very important that bringing about states of euphoria, and it's so easy to do. Get somebody to stare at something, get somebody to repeat a word over and over, get somebody to sit in so many techniques that are used. When Hebrew and Muslim scholars are reading texts, they daven, they do this.
Yeah.
And they're inducing states which make them feel good. And I recently wrote a chapter for a book about Eastern spirituality and psychiatry, and it interested me just listing the techniques one by one and saying, well, actually, fasting, sleep deprivation, things that are considered normal in religious groups, which
Yeah,
can lead to these states, which people will then think are some kind of supernatural gift, which are
of
actually
course.
no, it's just what happens when you stare at something for too long, you know.
Yeah, exactly. um, yeah, I'm actually trying to sort of complete a book that I started a couple of years ago, which is very much on this topic, and I'm quite interested to hear from, because my kind of background is obviously LGATs and then
Mm.
Christianity, and I think that there's definitely elements of the sort of dopaminergic defense that goes on in some forms of Christianity. But I'd love to hear
And how?
about how this process might be operating in Scientology and in other spaces as
Mm.
well.
Well,
Yeah,
in Scientology, you have a couple of thousand different procedures, which boil down to less than 10 approaches in all. But in almost all of them, you are to take the person to having very good indicators, which is, a way of depoeticizing the English language, which Hubbard was particularly good at. It's a way of inducing euphoria. You make somebody feel high. You make them want to write a testimonial, a success story. You make them want to, do you want others to have, the
is
gains you
this
now have?
is
This
there
kind of
some
thing.
form of suffering leading up to that?
Well, no, this will. There may be some sort of. It does get pretty crazy, but you have traumatic incidents that you're meant to be going through, and that will start with things that have happened to you in your life, and then you'll be
Yeah,
asked, is there an earlier similar incident of this? And magically you'll suddenly be transported into your past lives, where
yeah.
so and it's difficult to know the degree of trauma that's actually involved when you're dealing with imaginary material, because
Oh
I'm
well, I mean,
confident
I,
it is imaginary.
well, yeah, I mean, I think that that's the interesting thing about stress, is that we think of it as sort of a response to physical challenges, but we
Mm,
can conjure up these things in our minds very easily, and it leads to exactly the same stress response.
yeah.
So if you are thinking about something traumatic, whether or not it's happened or didn't happen, if you're thinking about it, it can generate quite a strong stress response.
Mm.
Um,
But you'd also have positive memories, which is called a straight wire procedure. And again, just by getting somebody to repeat the procedure, and in Scientology, the person giving the procedure, and they would say he's a counselor. I'm hesitant about using that term. They call them auditors, people who
yeah,
listen. But you are meant within these procedures to command the person. What you say is a command, it's not a question. And it's written down in front of you, and you have to use exactly the same words over and over again. And I'm sure that just through that repetition of the process, that people
yeah,
start to fall into a kind of altered state,
yeah.
euphoric state.
No, that makes sense. Certainly. I think I would find that quite unpleasant to have to keep doing it for, and they do it for a long period of time. I mean, that
2 hour
is
sessions
stressful.
are not unusual, and
Yeah, I mean that is stressful in itself.
mm,
Um, all right, then we get on to repetition,
mm,
which, I mean, I've literally got the word written down here, and we've just been speaking about it. But again, Cialdini, there's a great book called The Wisest One in the Room by Thomas Gilovich and Lee Ross, I think from Cornell University and Stanford University. They're social psychologists. And we are we're not very good as humans at distinguishing between the truth and things that we hear a lot of times.
mm,
So if we hear things frequently, we start assuming that they are true. And this is kind of like providing one side of the information, because if you're hearing the same information over and over again, but in LGATs, the trainer will repeat things over and over and over again. I mean, I noticed that in my training,
mm,
the leader. I also really don't like that term. But he would say things in quite a rhythmic tone, and he would say them over and over again. And we are very bad at distinguishing between truth and things that we hear a lot, particularly when we're operating in system one thinking or using the peripheral route. So the more engaged we are, the more likely we're able to go, okay, well, that's just something that I've heard a lot. But if we're tired, if we hear things a lot, they sound like they are true to us.
Yes.
And then finally, there's the idea of reciprocation, which is one of Cialdini's principles of persuasion. And what tends to happen in LGATs is that they will say to you, you've had this incredible experience and somebody's invited you to have this amazing experience. Now don't you think that you need to like pay this forward? Don't you feel like you need to do the same for somebody else as somebody has done for you? And obviously this is done when people are in this elevated state at the end of the training, and then people will commit to doing that. And because integrity has been emphasized such a lot and agreements have been emphasized such a lot, it makes it more likely that participants will actually go out and recruit people, because they don't want to break their integrity. That's something that's been drummed into them for the past 3 or 4 or 5 days. So those are just some of the things that are going on. In terms of the final euphoria that is generated, this is what I think is maybe one of the more interesting things from a psychological perspective. Is one of the rules in LGATs is almost without exception that you can't take notes. You're not allowed to write anything down. And that may seem like an arbitrary thing. It may seem like the reason for that is, I mean, the trainers will always have a justification for what they're doing. I believe that many of the justifications are misleading, but they will say, for example, we want you to focus on what's going on, right? Not being able to write things down, by the way, limits your ability in terms of the elaboration likelihood model. You can't review things if you haven't written anything down. But you haven't written anything down because they know that at the end, they're going to trigger this really powerful, positive experience. And there's something called the experiencing versus the remembering self. Kahneman speaks about it in Thinking Fast and Slow. He also refers to it as the peak end rule. So the peak end rule is that we don't remember things as they occur. We remember things as they are at their highest peak and how they are at the end. So, for example, studies have been done where they'll put people's hands into freezing cold water. So the first group of participants will put their hands, well, actually, they'll do it with the same group of participants. So it's usually a within participants design. If my students are listening, they should know what that means. But basically, the group of participants will put their hand into freezing cold water, let's just say for 2 minutes. And then they'll be allowed to go and do something else for a while. And then they'll come back when they've fully recovered. And then they'll put their hand in the same cold water for 2 minutes. And then maybe another 30 seconds where the water's still freezing, but not as freezing. So the end of the experience is more pleasant. So the second group has gone through all of the pain of the first group, plus some more pain, but it just wasn't quite as bad. And they'll ask the participants, without telling them exactly how long everything was, they'll ask them, which of the 2 situations would you prefer to do again? And the vast majority say they prefer the second situation because they remember it based on how it felt at the end, not... So even though the second experience is clearly worse, and they've done a number of other studies that have demonstrated this peak end rule, but essentially how it relates to LGATs is that participants get put through this incredible amount of stress for 3 or 4 or 5 days, but they're not allowed to write anything down. They don't have a very good recall of everything that has happened. At the end, they get pushed into this incredibly elevated state where they feel amazing, and then they feel like the entire process was amazing. I remember speaking to participants from the LGAT that I was a part of, and I asked them what they thought of it, and they said it was the greatest thing ever. And this was like a day or 2 later. It was the greatest thing ever. And so then I'd say to them, well, do you remember when the trainer was standing a foot away from that woman who was probably in her 60s, with the crucifix around her neck, and he was screaming in her face? And then you can kind of see them trying to reconcile what they do actually remember happening with their memory of the event. And the memory of the event is not in line with the actual events that happened over the previous 3 or 4 days. And so I think that participants are unaware that that rule applies, and that not being able to write things down, you can't go back and say, oh, I remember writing down, that was really horrible. I felt really tired or hungry or frustrated or angry or whatever the case was. Instead, because your peripheral route is being engaged, system 1, you don't have that information. You're using heuristics, and the heuristic is, I feel really good, therefore the experience must have been very good.
Yeah, I mean, we have a video, we mirrored a video called Captive Minds, Hypnosis and Beyond, made about 40 years ago on the channel. I still don't know anything that's better in explaining certain of the simple principles that are involved. And there's an interview with a Marine, and at one point he talks about being forced to stand with a kit bag over your head while being beaten by drill instructors with swagger sticks. And at another point in the interview, he says there was no unnecessary brutality in the
Yes,
Marines.
I think I've seen this before.
Yeah. And so you're kind of going, hang on, how we evaluate the experience afterwards, that we're fitting things into that heuristic, with fitting things into saying, well, that's the way things work and this is how it is. And as you say, looking back over the experience, having talked with more than 1,000 former members of Scientology and other groups, that the compartmentalization, the ability to regard this as a positive experience while having just a whole laundry list of horrors that happened along the way, that seems to be a quite common thing in human experience.
And I think you touched on something else there, where you said no unnecessary brutality, and it's likely that terminology was used in that process as well. I mean, when you hear people speaking about LGATs, you often hear tough love, which is a manipulation of language to kind of say, well, we're doing this for your own good. There was an interview, or there was a discussion between a Stanford professor and Werner Erhard from quite recently, and they speak about ruthless compassion. And again, I think that's a manipulation of language. For me, it's psychologically abusive, and I think for a lot of people who had to look at the actual interactions, if they weren't in that room and subject to the whole process, which LGATs love to say, well, if you haven't been through the whole process, then you've got no room to comment. But there's a very good reason for that, because the process is very effective at convincing people that what I would call psychological abuse is tough love or ruthless compassion or something of that sort. And if you would like to, read a little bit about it, you can read pages 192 to 318 of my PhD. That's on stress generated in LGATs. And these are not my words. These are all direct quotes pretty much from other people that have taken part and explained what they went through. If you think that that's tough love, well, good for you. If you think it's ruthless compassion, great. I think most people would look at it and say that seems to be psychologically abusive.
I mean, William Sargent in the 50s was making some of the early analyses of thought reform. He talks about paradoxical thinking, and he came up with what has proved to be a wrong idea of what the brain is doing in such ultra paradoxical excitation. But the paradox becomes very, very interesting, and it's not simply semantics. If we say ruthless compassion, then ruthless means without mercy. Now, that's not, there is no form of compassion that is without mercy. We're not talking about benefiting anybody when we talk about being ruthless. This is, And I was a particular thing about this because I left Scientology. One of the reasons was because the guy who leads it now, David Miscavige, said that the new regime was tough, which is okay, and ruthless. And for me, ruthlessness is a negative quality, always. There is no situation in which not having mercy towards somebody is the right thing. Then we move to compassion, which means feeling what the other person feels. Compassio, literally feeling together.
Yeah.
And so he's saying, I'm ruthless, but I'm feeling what you're feeling. The paradox, it's oxymoronic. It's not possible. And that again is a way that groups trap people by putting you into a double bind, into an idea that cannot make sense. And so you sort of suspend your judgment and say, well, they know what they're talking about. The danger
exactly.
in all authoritarian systems,
Yeah, so I mean, I think, and that goes back to the whole idea of the ability in terms of the elaboration likelihood model, is that you do get, and as I said, sort of philosophically pompous, like these ideas that don't like quite make sense. And so you're trying to get your head around them, and there's a lot of jargon thrown in as well that you're also trying to learn and understand. And it does make it less likely that you're really going to understand it. I mean, if you had to think about an environment that's designed for people to think rationally, to engage Kahneman's system 2, it wouldn't be an environment that you're there for 12 to 15 hours with short breaks, no real food, not being able to write anything down, having to do homework, doing that 3 or 4 days in a row. That's not the way for people to think through information. It's a perfect environment to get people to start using the peripheral routes, or start being persuaded through the peripheral routes. Another thing that I think people are unaware of is something called reciprocal connections. And again, Kahneman speaks about this in Thinking Fast and Slow. And the idea is that our minds work in 2 directions, even though we sometimes think of them only working in one. So, for example, if we are happy, we smile. That's how we think of the process. But also, if we smile, then we can actually make ourselves happy to a degree. And a study was done using, I'm sure you'll remember this, my students never do, Far Side cartoons, Gary Larson. Yeah, so they did a study with some Far Side cartoons, and they asked one group, and this would be a between participants design for my students in terms of an experiment. So they asked one group to put a pencil in their mouth sideways like that, and another group to put in their mouth like this. So, okay. So one group was smiling and one group was frowning. So just the facial muscles are doing something slightly different. And they just asked them to rate how funny they found the cartoons. And, when they compared the 2 groups to each other, the people that were smiling found the cartoons funnier than the group that was frowning. They've done 2 other good experiments that are very similar. One was, they said to one group, we want you to test this audio equipment. And so to elicit distortions, one group was told to nod their heads. The other group was told to shake their heads from side to side. Nodding is associated with agreement. Shaking your head is associated with disagreement. They played something in the background. So they played some piece of information in the background, but they didn't say pay attention to it. But they played it in the background. And then afterwards, they asked these participants a bunch of questions, some of which related to things that were said in the background. The people that were nodding their heads were far more likely to agree with what they had heard than the people that were shaking their heads from side to side, because unconsciously we're associating shaking our heads with we don't agree with this, nodding with we do agree with this. So how does this relate to LGATs? So one of the rules that you agree to in an LGAT is that you will applaud. When you are instructed to applaud, you must applaud. And it's one of these things that you hear people saying, applause was just insane. We had to applaud all the time. But when you read about it, applause happens when the trainer effectively wins the discussion. So once there's been an interaction, when the person comes on board with what the trainer has kind of been trying to put forward and has a breakthrough, that's when everyone applauds. And so unconsciously, again, because you're not engaging system 2, system 1 is running things after a couple of days, you associate the fact that you're applauding with things with agreeing with what's being said. And participants are not aware that this is influencing them.
No.
And
And
so
if we
just,
go down to, a very
yeah,
simple experiment that's often been repeated, where you have a bunch of people sat on chairs who all get up together and then sit down.
yes,
And when you introduce somebody new to the group, most people, and it's probably that 80% number,
yeah,
will actually, they've no idea why they're getting up and sitting down, but they'll do it. So the
for sure.
Solomon
And
Asch lines test and things like that. But
yes, yeah, yeah,
the part of that is the desire to fit in, to be part of a group. And that you make me think about a differentiation that's made in Scientology between thinking and looking. And thinking is held to be a bad thing, and looking is held to be a good thing. So you have the experience, and that's good, rather than thinking about something, and that's bad. And of
yeah.
course, thinking can actually be quite useful, I've found.
Yes, it's certainly not useful for people that are trying to get you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. So
Exactly.
telling people to come from their hearts and not from their heads, telling people that understanding is the booby prize, which these organizations do. There's a very heavy emphasis on convincing people that to reduce motivation to think. Linked to the applause is, and again, this comes down to the whole authority status. I spoke about the authority gap, so pushing people down, elevating the trainers up. There's something called, priming, which
Yeah.
again is spoken about in a number of these books on social psychology.
Mm.
And a good example of it is the Florida effect. So the Florida effect, again, a study was done where, and this is just representative of priming, where they gave people sentences to unscramble. So they gave one group of people a bunch of sentences to unscramble, and it included words like forgetful and bald and Florida and these things associated with being older. It's just some of the words. It wasn't obvious, and the participants weren't aware that those were the words that were in there. Another group they didn't do that to, and then all that they did was they timed how long these two groups of participants took to walk from the one room to another room that they had to get to. And the Florida group, the older group, took a lot longer. They walked a lot more slowly. They were primed to be associating with being a bit older. And that's, a very simple example. In LGATs, they spend a lot of time on regression exercises. So there are a lot of exercises that involve going back to when you were a child, remembering things, interactions with your mother and father. And there are two things that those exercises do. Obviously, they can generate a lot of stress, which is relevant to the dopaminergic defense. But the other thing is that they are priming participants to be in a childlike state. And children are far more likely to outsource their thinking to authority figures than adults are. So again, participants are not aware that by thinking about being a child, by putting themselves in that state for a period of time, it's making them more likely to outsource their thinking, particularly if they don't have the motivation or the ability to engage system two thinking. So these, and there are a lot of these things that are going on, and I just feel like participants, they don't have this information going in there, and they're unaware of it. So when they get to a point where they have got strong beliefs about what these programs are about and how useful they are and X, Y, and Z, they don't realize that that information has not been presented to them in what I would call a fair way. It hasn't been presented to them in a way which allows them to really evaluate the evidence and be autonomous in actually owning their decision on whether they want to support the organization or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic authoritarian situation where, as you say, you're being infantilized, you're being reduced, the authority of the group is being elevated. I can remember as a teenager wanting to understand how the world worked, and that being a desperate need to understand that, and feeling dissatisfied with the answers that I was being offered. So that I'd grown up in the Christian church and at the age of 13 had sort of gone, I don't like the sound of the God you believe in. He sounds deeply unpleasant to me. And somebody that would want to be worshipped is somebody that shouldn't be worshipped. So, if we can have a more friendly association, but it just suddenly stopped feeling credible to me. I then went from there, when I was about 17, I read the Tao Te Ching, which I still recommend as a remarkable text. You can buy my own translation of it here. That's useful because I didn't have to join the Taoist community. I didn't have to become part of anything. I just had this text that said these things that I could go away, digest, think about, and have been thinking about for 50 years now. But then I wandered into Zen Buddhism. And there's something to be said about the concept that Werner Erhard had. There's a point where he said that what he did was he took Zen Buddhism and added Scientology to it. And while I will accept that he did have a very simplistic notion of what Zen Buddhism is, he does not, to me, appear to be somebody who'd studied it with any seriousness. And I would say, sadly, I would say the same for many of the advocates of mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn particularly. They haven't studied Buddhism. But the concept that Erhard took from Zen, and it is particular to Zen among the Buddhist Mahayana groups, is the bursting of the bag. And this is the idea that you crowd the intellect so hard that somebody can no longer think for themselves. And the idea is there'll be an explosion. The confusion will cause this enlightenment, this illumination, satori as the Japanese call it. And from then on, you will see things as they are. Now, I am sad to say that 50 years later, I don't believe a word of this. I don't believe that confusing the hell out of people is useful for them. And I have terrible doubts about the Zen Buddhist community. Every sect, Soto, Abaku, Rinzai, they've all apologized for the training of the Japanese military from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 right through the Second War. They were all taught mindfulness on a daily basis. They practiced Zazen, which is the mindfulness meditation, which John Kabat-Zinn and more recently Daniel Goleman tell us is all you have to do to achieve compassion. You're sort of going, have you looked at what the Imperial Army did during World War II or what it did in Korea from enslaving the whole population in 1910? The Nanjing Massacre, killing 400,000 civilians. There's never been an event like it anywhere. Even Hiroshima does not, and Dresden don't come close in terms of the casualties. And the guy that performed the Nanjing Massacre received a letter of commendation from his Zen master. So the idea that these guys, generation on generation, are passing this wisdom of enlightenment down, sorry, can't buy that. So, and Erhard buys into this simple idea, and I'm sort of going, well, if I'm going to let somebody explode my mind, I've got to be pretty trusting about who they are. This hasn't got to be like, a friend of mine said this was really great, and my wife says she'll leave me if I don't do it. I'd need a bit more than that now, but it's 50 years later for me. I've had a long time to consider these ideas, and sadly, young people aren't taught this.
Yeah, and I think the thing that it also comes back to is that participants are told not to reveal any detail about what actually takes place. They're told that will spoil the experience. So
it's the same way that with psychics, that it doesn't work if there are disbelievers in the room,
Yeah. So what else? There was something else that I wanted to mention. I think the last thing was the monitoring. And again, you read about this in social psychology books that have got no association with LGATs or problematic groups, but their comments, I think it's in the Gilovich and Ross book, but there's a statement something along the lines of there can be no doubt that the portraits of a leader on the wall shuts down critical thinking. So having the sort of all-knowing, all-seeing leader on the wall, kind of like Big Brother,
Very much
is
like Big Brother. And
is
that,
going
that
to
was the
limit.
exact analogy I came to when I joined Scientology. There were all these
Yeah,
pictures of this man, and it worried me from the start, but not
yeah.
enough, evidently.
I mean, they've even done those very basic studies where they put a set of eyes next to an honesty jar for food in people's in university canteens and that sort of thing. And if there are eyes there or if there are flowers there, they compare, you know, how honest people have been. And when the eyes are there, people are a lot more honest. In an LGAT, you've always got a trainer, but you've also got a number of assistants that are kind of sitting behind you, and you can't see them, or they're walking around sort of monitoring everything that's going on. So you don't feel like you can speak to somebody because that's one of the rules, but you just feel like you're being watched and monitored the whole time. And a lot of people comment on that. So again, that's not very useful for generating independent thinking. You know, I mean, Big Brother is literally the prototype of an authoritarian society. So having an environment where you feel like you're constantly being monitored is very similar to, you know, the situation in 1984. Yeah.
And it's something that is typical in our education system. You know, I wrote something about authoritarianism the other day, which I may or may not use somewhere. But it was sort of, well, how did this start for me? What my concern with authoritarianism, the idea of, you know, the all-knowing leader who tells us what to do and we aren't clever enough, so we do what they say, which does appear to affect the majority of people in our society. Perhaps 60% of people are responsive to that kind of rank authority. And for me, going to school at the age of 5 and suddenly finding myself in an environment where there were these big people who shouted at me and could, and a couple of times did, hit me,
Yeah.
quite capriciously. And I'd come, you know, I was very lucky. I came from a highly functional family. I have 3 older brothers. There's a fair amount of rough and tumble, but it was a fair environment. It wasn't an environment where anybody was being belittled, you know, or put down. And moving into this environment where it was perfectly normal to be obedient, to do as you were told. And I think, you know, setting that standard, I mean, I always defer to my friend Ira Chaloff and his book Intelligent Disobedience, which I think should be read by all school teachers, by all teachers, to say we really should be, if we're going to cultivate independence, assertiveness, critical thinking, we have to teach people how to disagree. We have to teach people how to respectfully, you know, to disagree agreeably, as I say. That, and kids are just not being taught that, so they're being prepared as lambs for the slaughter by these groups, which will exploit them, and as you say, take over their interpretation of reality. And as children, yeah, we don't know how to interpret reality, and we're not taught. It's as if there's a fear that if we learn the tricks of thinking, we might disagree with the way our, let's face it, rather crazy society functions.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. The study that I've actually just sent through, or a month or so maybe ago, to a journal, is on freedom of expression at higher education institutions, and it's a big problem. There's an organization, the Heterodox Academy in the United States. Jonathan Haidt was one of the founders of it, and they do this campus expression survey in the US to see how willing students are to speak about controversial topics. So it's that's not so much about critical thinking, but it's about the ability to engage on controversial topics, which is crucial for critical thinking. Yes. And it just seems like a lot of higher education students are unwilling to engage on anything that may be controversial. They're very worried about being seen to be offensive, you know, which is it's a real challenge. And it's sad when you see young people losing that confidence to push back, and you sort of see them, you know, sitting back and looking a bit defeated and realizing there's no point in this. I'm just going to kind of go with the program.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen an incredible shift. My dear late friend Alan Shefflin, who passed a couple of weeks ago, we were going to do an interview about what it was that had made him give his lifetime to understanding exploitative persuasion, undue influence, coercive control. And he told me that, and sadly we didn't record the interview, but he told me that in 1963 he went to he was a student, and he went to a talk by George Lincoln Rockwell. Rockwell was the head of the American Nazi Party. So I think we know her. And Alan was bemoaning the cancel culture and saying, now he wouldn't be allowed to talk. But he may have inspired a few people to become Nazis, but he inspired a lot of us to stand up against the idea of fascism. And it's the presumption that people's minds can be so easily swayed, by some diabolic influence, rather than teaching people to say, well, and I've spent a lifetime doing it. If somebody has what is to me an odious belief, I'll sit down and talk with them in the hope that I can perhaps get them to see things a little differently. And sometimes that happens, which is good. Whereas if I go, well, I'm not talking to you because we get nowhere. You get the megaphone culture.
100% agree. So I'd like to speak about a couple of things now, and these are the things that may be slightly controversial. So what I'd like to talk about now that we've got an understanding of the elaboration likelihood model and peripheral thinking and the likelihood of people outsourcing their thinking to authority figures or things like that, I'd like to speak about three sort of major forms of evidence used by one of the big large group awareness trainings. So the first is, if you go onto, and I won't mention the name of the organization, but if you go onto their website, they've got a section called independent research. So one would think that all of their best research would be sitting there. Anyone that knows anything about how research is conducted would look at those studies and would, be very, very concerned that these are being taken seriously. None of them are published in a peer-reviewed journal, and that's where the quality of the study can actually be assessed. And given the magnitude of the claims that are made by LGATs in terms of, they say that they can generate transformations and miracles and X, Y, and Z. They make very bold claims about what they can do, and these are lasting changes that they promise. If they could do a fraction of what they claim that they could do, then a well-designed study with good methodology would be able to pick up evidence of those claims. When you look at the studies that are on that website, you don't see any studies that are published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Yes.
So if they want to be taken more seriously, they've got the money to get studies done by professionals. And if they are achieving what they claim to achieve, they would have studies published that demonstrate what they claim. They don't. That is concerning.
Let me make a side comment on that. I went and grabbed my copy of The Buddha Pill by Miguel Farias and Catherine Wickham. And in this, Farias, they're working at Oxford University. Farias is the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Meditation. He's a mindfulness practitioner who admits in this book that he became a meditation junkie and had to cut back. And he had he asked two postgraduate students to do a database search for articles related to meditation. And they found more than 4,000 articles. And cutting those back, they came to the conclusion, I think, that 32 of the studies that were cited in these articles, 32 were actually performed using the proper criteria for a study. So out of 4,032. And he comes to this conclusion, despite the anecdotal evidence on the merits of mindfulness meditation, despite the hundreds of studies produced in the last 20 years, there was no robust scientific evidence that mindfulness has any substantial effect on our minds and behaviors. So these studies will be presented, but we have to learn how to look at a study to see if it's been properly replicated, to see if the
And
people...
again, that is ability and motivation.
Yeah.
So do you have the ability to understand studies? Do you have the motivation to learn how to understand studies? And if you don't, then you're just going to trust what you're given. I mean, strangely, the same organization, or let's just say the precursor to the same organization, had a study done by Fisher et al. In 1989. What is it called? It's called Psychological Effects of Participation in a Large Group Awareness Training. All right, so this study was done with the support of Werner Erhard and Associates. He is literally thanked in the notes on the study. The study found, and this was a study that was published in a journal, it found almost no short-term effects and found zero long-term effects. So if this organization is aware of this peer-reviewed study, why is that study not available for people to have a look at? And why are other studies made available? So that, to me, is concerning.
And looking at all of those studies that were done by the tobacco industry that showed that tobacco is completely harmless. In fact, it's good for you, you know.
Additionally, one of the 7, again, independent studies is a case study by Harvard Business School on this organization. Harvard has explicitly said our case studies do not serve as an endorsement of anything. It's just for classroom discussion purposes. This is from like 1998. I think 1998, Harvard called the organization out and said, this is not an endorsement of your organization. It is still on their website as evidence of the effectiveness. So if I had to do a study in psychopathology on Jeffrey Dahmer or on Charles Manson, it doesn't mean that I endorse Charles Manson or Jeffrey Dahmer. It's a very strange thing to claim.
I'd like to point out I am actually doing a study on Charles Manson at the moment.
And
I do not endorse him.
Exactly. So just because you're doing a study on somebody is not the same as endorsing them. And if you actually go and read what the organization is allowed to share about what this case study said, it doesn't say anything positive about them. There's just the assumption that people are going to go, oh, Harvard, make the connection and assume that there's an endorsement when there isn't. And explicitly from Harvard's perspective, there's not an endorsement. So these things can serve as heuristics that convince people that there's legitimacy in what is going on when maybe there's not. So that's the first of the 3.
Let me interject that the nutrition guru Adele Davis, who was huge in the 50s and 60s, wrote books like Let's Eat Right to Keep Fit. And eventually she was taken to court by somebody who'd followed some of her protocols. And I believe it had led to the death of a child. And but it was serious enough to end up in court. And it came out in court that she hired researchers to look out every paper on the subject of nutrition so that she could list them in the backs of her books. They didn't make any notes of what was said in these studies, and she certainly didn't look at them. And so it was solely there to pad her authority, to make her look as if she knew what she was talking about, which she most certainly didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ben Goldacre's got a great book called Bad Science.
It is a great book. I have it right here. Yeah,
there's I think he does a TED talk. He does a talk on YouTube, which is also great, just for getting people to think about the fact that authority figures can be very misleading. He speaks about his dead cat Hetty getting some qualification that a nutritionist has on their CV, and that's a perfect example of having these things making you sound better than what you are, and not looking beyond it and assuming that you should trust a person based on these, misleading qualifications.
He also gets into statistical interpretation, and so you get this thing that it's now found that it was twice as likely that this will happen. And then when you look to the paper, they've gone from 0.001% to 0.002%. So it is indeed twice as likely. But what's been taken away is the likelihood is incredibly low.
Yeah. I actually use a similar example with bipolar disorder. So they speak about bipolar disorder having a much greater chance of aggression than the general public. But again, when you look at the actual figures, it's, from 1% to 2% or something.
It's doubled.
Something like that. And then if you remove alcohol from the equation, then it's actually just the same. So the devil's in the detail. So the second dubious endorsement is from the former head or CEO of the American Psychological Association, Raymond Fowler, who endorsed Landmark in 1999. And all that I'd like to mention about this is that there are things about it that seem off to me, and I'd like to get somebody's response on this, because this seems strange to me. Okay, so Fowler in 1965 was on the Council of Representatives for the American Psychological Association. In 1979, he was on the board of directors. In 1983, he became the treasurer. And then from 1988 to 2003, he was the president and CEO of the American Psychological Association. So over that whole period, he had a very clear, deep involvement in the APA. In 1983, which is the same year he became treasurer, the APA, they put together a committee called the DIMPAC Committee. So it's a committee for deception on indirect and means of persuasion and control, or something like that. Let me think about it. So the DIMPAC Committee, and it was led by Dr. Margaret Singer. And so from 1983 to 1986, they were asked to look into large group awareness trainings and cults and to produce a report. And the report was rejected in 1987. So the APA rejected the report. And then in 1992, Singer and Richard Offshire sued the APA. So there was clearly a lot of controversy around it. That's
the so-called memory wars.
Yeah. So and from everything that I've read about it, it seems like that this was a fairly controversial issue amongst psychologists. So there were some that were on the side of Singer and Offshire. There were some that were on the side of the APA ruling, but it certainly was a contentious issue. It wasn't just like, this is a fringe group of people and, we don't want anything to do with them. So in 1995, Singer included Landmark in her book, Cults in Our Midst, and she was sued in 1996.
Yep.
So we've got this history, right? We've got Fowler, who's now the president and CEO of the APA. We've had this ruling against the DIMPAC committee. We've got this lawsuit suing the APA. We've got Singer being sued for mentioning Landmark in her book, and that's in 1996. And then in 1999, Fowler decides that he's going to personally endorse Landmark. So he writes this report basically saying, among other things, that the environment of the training was pleasant, okay, that the leader was pleasant and sensitive, and that the participants seemed relaxed. Okay, again, read pages 192 to 318 of my PhD, and you can make up your mind about whether it seems participants were relaxed, whether the trainer seemed pleasant and sensitive, and whether the environment was pleasant. They've even got a disclaimer saying, it's incredibly stressful for a lot of people. So my question is, if you're the head of the APA and you're approached by an organization to provide an endorsement, and you know that there's huge controversy amongst psychologists about this group and amongst groups like it, why do you not say, rather ask somebody else? Why do you do that? It seems a very odd thing for the president of an organization like that to do. So I'd just like to leave that, and I think you can kind of think about that for yourself. In the report, it doesn't say anything about any possible conflict of interest. It doesn't note that other people have got conflicting views, which clearly there were at the time. It doesn't say whether or not he was being paid for it or how much he was being paid for it. And again, these are things that you expect in a, for example, a journal article that you're publishing, because you want to know whether there's a possible reason that this information might be biased in a way. If he wasn't getting paid, great, then say that. It would seem that if he wasn't getting paid, he would have maybe said that, but I could be wrong about that.
And we have, I mean, throughout from the 1970s onwards, that there's been quite a cohort of social scientists who've aligned themselves with groups which some of us consider to be authoritarian cults. So we've had the growth of this idea of the new religious movement.
Yeah.
Very interested when a year or so back, I interviewed Eileen Barker, who's one of the people who introduced this term. She was at LSE, and she wrote a book called New Religious Movement. She told me in this interview she no longer uses the term because she does not consider it accurate. And then finding that many scholars in this field, Gordon J. Melton, for example, or James Lewis, but there are quite a roster of them, have actually received funding to do their work, which puts it off a little bit sideways. The problem that I had with Eileen Barker's original work with the Moonies in the 1970s is that it relies on participant observation. And that's what you've just described, the head of the APA going in and saying, well, the environment seemed pleasant and this, that, and the other. On the other side of that is my good friend Steve Hassan, who was trained to deal with social scientists who were doing participant observation. So you know this guy's coming in and, you know, you give him the experience that you want him to have to give you the report. And so, you know, the 3-day workshops that the Moonies do, which are, you know, they're LGAT type forms. And, you know, Eileen came away and said, well, only 11% of people stayed after the 3 days. Therefore, this is not a bad thing. And you're going, it only harms 11% of people. This is not a good thing. I have a different perspective here. But that it is so easy to take somebody, and there are so many other factors. As you say, they may be paid, that there may be some familial connection that they have. There may be some benefit to their reputation for doing this. So with the Moonies, Eileen admitted to going to 14 fully paid 5-star holidays to go to Mooney conferences, and said that she allowed them to pay for this so that her university wouldn't have to. Former British Prime Minister, UK Prime Minister Ted Heath, went to their meetings as well because, hey, it's a 5-star hotel in Hawaii and a free trip. You've got to declare an interest, and if you don't, then it's worthless. And why on earth would the head of the APA be endorsing any organization? Surely that should be a matter
very
for a
odd. So as I
committee.
say, he was the head of the APA from 88 to 2003. So I mean, it's really right in the middle of. I mean, he'd been there for a really long time. Very authoritative person. I mean, the other possibility, you know, to give him the benefit of the doubt, is the Hawthorne effect. But he should be aware of that as the head of the APA. So they may change their behavior and run things slightly differently when they know that they're being observed. But for somebody like that to have been negligent enough to not have looked into the descriptions of what goes on by anyone else while making the endorsement seems a little bit strange, considering how much the APA had been engaging with people that had criticisms of LGATs over the past 10, 15 years. It seems very unlikely that he was unfamiliar with some of the criticisms of what takes place in them. Yeah. So this glowing review saying everything was pleasant and everyone was happy and just seems very strange, to put it mildly.
Absolutely.
All right, so the third one is more recent. So there's a YouTube video called Conversations on Compassion with Werner Erhard. So you can have a look at this yourself. I think it was uploaded in 2017. So Erhard is getting on. He's looking quite old, but he's sitting on stage with somebody named Dr. James Doty. who's a professor of neurosurgery at Stanford University. And I found that there were inaccuracies in terms of what was being said by Dr. Doty. And I actually contacted him, and he agreed that what he had said was not true. So I'll be very careful about what I say here. I'm going to read things in terms of our correspondence, but you can go and watch the video in terms of what he does say. I'd like to first mention, though, the way that he was introduced by Earhart. Given what we know about elevating authority statuses, this is what Earhart said to introduce him. He says, the first thing I need to do is, if you don't really know who James Doty is, you're privileged to be in the presence of a truly extraordinary human being. Take the time to look up James Doty on the internet so that you can know who you had the chance to be with. Really, really, really makes my hair stand on end when I think about what the guy has accomplished, and maybe even more powerfully, who he actually is. Okay, so if that's not elevating the authority status of somebody, if you go and you look him up online, it's very impressive. There's pictures of him with the Dalai Lama. He runs the care facility at Stanford. He's a professor of neurosurgery. So clearly a very impressive person. So I'm watching this interaction now, and then Doty gets up and he starts speaking about Earhart. So they are complimenting each other. It's his chance to say wonderful things about Earhart. And he says at one point, he says, if you followed EST, if you know anything about the Landmark Forum, you will know that these organizations do amazing things in people's lives. And then he says very specifically, there have been innumerable studies which have demonstrated very scientifically the positive effect that EST and these types of organizations have on people's lives. And so I was sitting there thinking, I've done a literature review on this. I've been studying this for a long time. I don't know of any studies that demonstrate very scientifically. So if he's referring to the studies that are on their website, he should know as a professor at Stanford what a scientific study is. And I would think that a scientific study is published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's not just a marketing company that you've got to do a survey for you. That's not a very scientific study, as he refers to it. So I contacted him. I sent him an email and I said, hi, I would really like you to point me towards some of these innumerable scientific studies that show the incredible benefits that these organizations have. And he ignored me. And then I waited about a week, and then I sent him another email and I said, I don't know if you missed the previous email. Please, can you point me towards any of these studies that demonstrate very scientifically? And I'd love to read you his response.
Please do. We'd love to hear it.
What did he say? Okay, so eventually he replies, no studies have yet been completed, so there's nothing published, as well as the final study design and sign-off is not complete. I'm not sure where you found the quotes demonstrated very scientifically the positive effect that EST and these types of trainings have on people. It was not from me. I know of no such study, only anecdotal statements. And then later, he sent me another email that just said, if the quote is from me, which I don't recall, it is not true. Okay, so
oh dear,
you've got this incredible authority figure who's been elevated as an authority figure, saying these incredible things about these organizations. If you are using if you assume the peripheral route is in place, you don't know anything about them, nobody's going to tell you because they're not allowed to tell you what actually takes place. Is this something worth doing? Well, you've got this guy who's got seen hugging the Dalai Lama and is a professor of neurosurgery at Stanford telling you that it's amazing. You're going to outsource your thinking to that person. So I think that something like that can be very damaging. There's no point at which he recalls this statement. He doesn't make a statement that says, actually, I was wrong about this. So that's floating around out there, and people are making their decisions about taking part based on that information, which he himself acknowledges is not true. interestingly, Earhart is sitting next to him while he's saying this, and he's clearly aware that those studies don't exist either. So why does he not say, that's not exactly 100% correct?
Yeah.
Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to end up going to one of these seminars, and you're going to be lectured for 3 days about integrity by these people. So I find that's very interesting. Yeah.
And let me just put in another point about authority. The Dalai Lama has also been
Yes.
seen hugging Osahara, the head of Aum Shinrikyo, who gave him $1.25 million, and hugging Keith Raniere, the head of Nixium, who's now in prison for 120 years, who gave the Dalai Lama $2 million. So I don't want to undermine anybody's faith here, but who we choose as authorities and who we choose as representing what is good in the world, they're shifting sands.
Exactly. And this is why you need to look beyond the superficial.
Yeah.
You can't just look at these superficial indicators of authority, of knowledge, of whatever. You have to engage and make sure you understand things for yourself. Yeah.
And that is very much the point, isn't it? That we should develop as individuals. We should develop as people individually. That we should be able have our own conscience, our own morality. We should have our own sense of how to be in the world, rather than the authoritarian model, which is where, well, I don't know, tell me what to do. Which, of course, we're all born helpless, and we all have to go through acquiring these abilities. And it is probable and likely, as many people have said, Eric Fromm, Schopenhauer, Stanley Milgram, that perhaps 60% of people will not develop a self, because they will be caught up in the, what are the Jones doing so that I can look right and I can act right and I can do things in the right way. And so the very things that we should be nurturing in people are actually being destroyed by LGATs. They're making people more conformist to a set of ideas which have not been proved to be healthy for us. And we do see tragedies and disasters on the side of that. I've certainly met people who feel their lives were ruined by their experience.
I've met a number of people whose lives have been ruined by taking part, either theirs through the injury of family members, through family members becoming so obsessed that it just causes a divide. I think that the downside is often not looked at very, very carefully.
Yeah. So, have we got to the end of your notes, John, for today?
End of my notes. I don't know if I have mentioned this before, but just maybe a kind of link on the relevance of LGATs in the troubled teen industry. I don't know if we've spoken about that at all.
No, please do. I've just done a piece on troubled teens with Casey.
I think that, and I won't go into it in very much detail, but I think it is important for people to know that one of the major large group awareness trainings from the 1970s and 1980s was called LifeSpring. And one of its trainers, a person named David Gilcrease, created an organization called Resource Realizations. And it seems he started offering seminars at a lot of these troubled teen facilities. And the seminars, from what I've seen and from what I've looked at, are almost identical to the LifeSpring training. So you have some of the bigger LGATs today who will try to screen people out in terms of mental health conditions and vulnerability. Not that I think that their screening is very effective, but what's happening in the troubled teen industry, or what has been happening for the last 20, 30 years, even more, is that you've had a group of young kids, really, who are a vulnerable group to start off with. Many of them have got pre-existing conditions, anxiety, depression, borderline personality disorder, these sorts of things. So you're taking a very, very vulnerable group of people and you're putting them through a process that, healthy adults can often be affected negatively by. And there's no screening going on for them. And so, yeah, I think it's just important that people are aware of that. And I think it's obviously terrible, but one of the useful things that's come out with a lot of exposure of the troubled teen industry is that people are starting to care. So it's one thing when adults get involved in Scientology and in LGATs and that sort of thing. A lot of people kind of say, well, you've got freedom of choice. Forget about the manipulation that got you in there, but tough luck. When it's happening to kids, people are a lot more sensitive about it, and it's great because now they're looking at what's going on. They're looking at what takes place in these seminars, and they're asking important questions about what evidence is there for their effectiveness. What does the evidence say about possible harm that could be caused, and should these teenagers be going through these programs, and hopefully should anyone be going through these programs is the next step.
Yeah, I mean, and looking at material on the so-called brat camps, boot camps for teenagers, and finding that some poor teenager can be dragged out of their home, out of their bed in the middle of the night, kidnapped, and then taken away and isolated and put through a program which is incredibly similar to the Chinese thought reform program. This is truly shocking. We did have some kind of comparison in this country, which I talked about with Casey when we talked about troubled teens. In the early 70s, that there was a reform school called Pepper Harrow.
Was it Casey from Cult Vault?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I know Casey.
And she's great. So it's something she's done. She's interviewed, I think, 6 survivors of these camps on her channel. Yeah. But I brought up the case of Pepper Harrow, which was this kind of hippie-run reform school in the early 70s in the UK. And they were just ridiculously liberal with the kids. The thing that shocked me because they revisited 20 years later, and they talked to 4 of the 6 kids who'd been involved in the original documentary. In the original documentary, you got an 8-year-old walking around smoking a cigarette. Yeah. And I'm sort of, I'm liberal, but that's a bit much. But we then find in around about 1980, under Margaret Thatcher, a man called William Whitelaw brought in what was called the short, sharp shock, quoting about chopping people's heads off in The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan. But he thought it was funny, so that kids would now be put into this boot camp environment and forced through this militaristic training. And we have statistics. Pepper Harrow had a reoffence rate of 10%. The Whitelaw program had a reoffence rate of 80%. I think that looks to the problem and is like, you cannot brutalize people into compassion. You cannot brutalize people into fitting in. You're going to hammer them into subservience.
Does not work.
I'm sorry.
So ruthless compassion does not work.
No, it's and tough love is so often used as an excuse for you've got to be cruel fundamentally. It's not about being helpful to anybody. It's good to see that there is exposure of these terrible criminal assaults upon children, and children should have the same rights as the rest, as adults, to not being kidnapped, to not being locked up, to not being isolated in a little pup tent for 2 weeks, not allowed to speak to people. It doesn't work. It won't make a better world.
Yeah.
Grand.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, John.
Thank you. It's been fascinating.
Great. Yeah, there was a lot that we managed to get through there, so hopefully it's stuck with some people. Yeah, but I mean, all of these ideas again are in my PhD. So if anyone wants to run through them more slowly, the contents does kind of tell you where all of these things are discussed, and you can run through the evidence in your own time.
And we will
have that. If you have the motivation and the ability, then it's you don't have to read through the full 500 pages. You can just find the parts that are relevant to you and have a look at the evidence.
Yeah, and take a look at the first video we did, and we will soon be your video for ICSA the embargo will run out, and we'll be able to
less than 2 weeks. Great.
Yeah, looking forward to that. And we will notify you when the video goes up, so that if you want to respond to comments, and hopefully there will be some comments, then people can address you directly with any questions they have.
Great.
So thank you very much indeed. And we'll arrange something in the future once we have switched off the recording and the audience are no longer watching. So we'll do that in secret afterwards.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John.
Thanks a lot.
Right. Cheers then.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.